If August 1763 was the month of the miracle at Bushy Run, where British bayonets broke the myth of native invincibility, then September 1763 was the month that brutally snapped the British Empire back to reality. As the first crisp breezes of autumn began to cool the fever-ridden forts of the frontier, a dangerous complacency threatened to settle over the colonies. Colonel Henry Bouquet had relieved Fort Pitt. The siege was broken. In the eastern cities, merchants and ministers breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that the Indian uprising had been crushed. They assumed that the savages, having been defeated in open battle, would melt back into the woods and sue for peace. They were wrong. September 1763 demonstrated that Pontiac's war was not a mere riot to be put down with a single battle. It was a sophisticated, multi-front conflict that was evolving. While the British controlled the forts, the Native American coalition owned the wilderness between them. And in September, they shifted their tactics from besieging fortified walls to a terrifying campaign of guerrilla logistics warfare. They targeted the lifelines, the supply wagons, the portage roads, and the schooners that kept the British hold on the West alive. This month is defined by the Battle of Devil's Hole, the single deadliest engagement for the British Army during the entire war. It was a massacre that did not happen in the deep woods of Ohio, but on the vital supply artery of Niagara, proving that the contagion of rebellion had spread to the darkest corners of the Iroquois Confederacy. September 1763 was a month of supply chain terror, naval heroics on the Great Lakes, and the grim realization in London and America that the victory over France had merely cleared the stage for a much longer, bloodier struggle for the entire continent. First, let's look at the naval war that broke out on the Detroit River. You see, there was the lifeline. To understand September 1763, one must understand the geography of survival. Detroit, the British headquarters in the West, was an island in a sea of hostility. Major Gladwin and his garrison were starving. They had only one connection to the outside world, the Detroit River, leading to Lake Erie and eventually to the supply depot at Niagara. The British possessed two small warships, the schooners Huron and Michigan. These wooden boats were the difference between life and death. If Pontiac could sink them, Detroit would certainly fall. So this led to the attack on the Huron on September 3rd and 4th. The month opened with a cinematic battle on the water. The schooner Huron had been to Niagara to pick up supplies and was returning to Detroit. It anchored for the night in the Detroit River, just miles from the fort. The ship was manned by a skeleton crew, only Captain Horsey and about 10 men. And then there was the assault. Under the cover of a pitch-black night on September 3rd, nearly 350 warriors in birch bark canoes silently surrounded the vessel. They swarmed the sides, hacking at the netting and climbing through the gun ports. So what was the defense? It was a desperate, hand-to-hand brawl on the deck. Captain Horsey was cut down instantly. The mate, taking command, realized that they were about to be overwhelmed. He shouted down the hatch to the gunner, "Blow up the ship! Put the match to the magazine!" But here was the turning point. The native warriors, understanding some English, heard the order. Terrified of being blown to pieces, they abandoned the attack, diving into the river and swimming for shore. So what was the result? Well, the Huron limped into Detroit the next morning, its decks slick with blood, but its cargo intact. This event, occurring in the first week of September, was critical. It proved that the British could maintain their logistics by water even if the land was lost. It was a morale booster that kept the garrison fighting. But then there was the disaster at Devil's Hole. While Detroit held, a catastrophe was brewing to the east. The Niagara portage was the jugular vein of the British West. It was a steep, difficult road around Niagara Falls where goods had to be carried by wagon from the lower river to the upper river. So this was the expansion of the war. Until September, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, or Six Nations, had remained largely neutral or British aligned, thanks to the diplomacy of Sir William Johnson. But the Seneca, the westernmost Iroquois nation, were angry. They had lost their monopoly on the portage work to British wagons. They were culturally drifting away from the Mohawk, who were pro-British, and toward Pontiac. In September 1763, the Seneca entered the war. So here was the trap on September 14th, 1763. On a crisp Wednesday morning, a British wagon train carrying supplies from Fort Schlosser above the falls to Fort Niagara below the falls was moving along the cliff edge of the Niagara Gorge. First, think about the geography here. The road passed through a narrow defile known as Devil's Hole. On one side was a steep wooded cliff. On the other, a 300-foot drop into the roaring rapids of the Niagara River. This led to the ambush. Roughly 300 to 500 Seneca warriors were waiting. At a signal, they unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire. Then they rushed from the woods with tomahawks. And that, of course, created a massacre. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The terrified horses stampeded, dragging wagons and drivers over the precipice to be crushed on the rocks below. Those who didn't fall were butchered on the road. Only 2 or 3 men escaped the initial attack. But that wasn't all. There was a second trap. The Seneca anticipated the British reaction perfectly. Hearing the gunfire, 2 companies of the 80th Regiment Light Infantry, stationed at the lower landing, grabbed their muskets and sprinted up the road to rescue the convoy. But that was the bait. They ran directly into a second ambush. The Seneca had redeployed in a crescent formation, which ultimately led to destruction. As the winded soldiers rushed into the woods, they were enveloped. A close-range volley decimated their ranks. The survivors were hunted down. So what was the toll of this? Well, by the end of the day, over 80 British soldiers were dead, including several officers. It was the largest loss of life for the British in the entire war. Worse than Bloody Run, worse than the fort captures. So what was the consequence? Well, the news of Devil's Hole, which filtered out in late September, sent a shockwave through the British command. It created a diplomatic crisis. It meant that the Iroquois Confederacy was fracturing. If the Six Nations joined Pontiac, the British could lose New York. It also created logistical paralysis. The massacre effectively shut down the Niagara portage. No supplies could move west. Detroit and Fort Pitt were now cut off from their winter stockpiles. The specter of famine returned. Then there was the stalemate at Fort Pitt. See, here was Bouquet's dilemma. At the forks of the Ohio, Colonel Henry Bouquet spent September dealing with the frustrating reality of winning. He had relieved Fort Pitt in August, but his army was shattered. He had no offensive. Bouquet wanted to march north to relieve Detroit or attack the Delaware villages in the Muskingum Valley. But in September, he took stock of his men. They were sick, wounded, and exhausted. He lacked the manpower to even leave the fort. So that led to the strengthening of the defenses. Bouquet spent the month reinforcing the walls and, crucially, trying to open a line of communication back to Philadelphia. The woods were still dangerous. Small parties of Shawnee warriors continued to harass the supply lines, stealing horses and scalping stragglers. But at least the smallpox receded. By September, the horrific smallpox epidemic inside the fort began to burn itself out, partly due to the biological warfare measure of the summer, but mostly due to the natural course of the virus. The garrison was alive, but immobile. There was, of course, the ongoing paper war in London. While blood flowed in the Niagara Gorge, ink flowed in Whitehall. September 1763 was the month that the British government finalized the policy that would alienate the colonists forever. The Lords of Trade, led by the Earl of Shelburne and soon replaced by the Earl of Hillsborough, were analyzing the maps of North America. Here was their logic. The news of the summer's violence, which reached London with a 6-week delay, confirmed their worst fears. The colonists were incapable of managing the frontier. Their greed for land caused expensive wars. So that led to their decision that in September, the language of the Proclamation of 1763 was hardened. The boundary line down the Appalachians would not be a temporary suggestion. It would be a royal decree. But here was the conflict. At the same time, agents for the colonies like Benjamin Franklin were in London lobbying for huge land grants in the Ohio Valley. In September 1763, the British government was secretly deciding to deny the very petitions that the Americans were submitting. The official mind of the empire and the colonial mind were moving in diametrically opposite directions. And then there were the ever-growing concerns about the cost of empire. Prime Minister George Grenville spent September reviewing the treasury. Here was the expense. The reports from America were grim. General Amherst was requesting more money for provisions, more money for transport, more money for Indian gifts, which he had previously cut. This led to the following resolve. The disaster at Devil's Hole, once known, would add to the bill. To Grenville, the equation was becoming undeniable. The British taxpayer is being bled dry to protect American land speculators. A tax on the colonies is the only moral solution. Let's look at the texture of colonial life here in September of 1763. First, there was the boiling pot of Paxton. In Pennsylvania, September was a month of seething rage. The raids continued. Despite Bouquet's victory, isolated raiding parties slipped through the screen and attacked farms in Northampton and Berks counties. So what did the Quaker Assembly do? Well, the Assembly in Philadelphia continued to refuse to fund a large-scale militia offensive, citing cost and religious scruples, which in turn, of course, fed radicalization. In the taverns of Lancaster and Paxton, the Scots-Irish settlers began to organize. They stopped looking to the government for protection and began looking to themselves. The rhetoric of September was violent and racial. The government protects the Indians while we die. This was the gestation period of the Paxton Boys' vigilantism. There was also still the economic depression. The news in the mercantile centers of Boston and New York remained bleak. There was much talk of insolvency. The credit collapse deepened. With the Niagara portage closed by the Seneca, the fur trade was effectively dead for the year 1763. This meant no remittances to London. There was also labor unrest. In Boston, the unemployed sailors and dock workers were becoming a political force. The Caucus Club, the political machine of Samuel Adams, was beginning to tap into this anger, directing it not at the economic cycle, but at the luxury and corruption of the British officials. There were also still echoes of the religious Great Awakening. September 1763 saw a resurgence of apocalyptic preaching. Here's the interpretation. Ministers interpreted the Indian War and the smallpox as divine judgments. The message was that New England had lost its way. This spiritual anxiety fed into the political anxiety. If the people were sinful, God sent tyrants and savages to punish them. To regain God's favor, they must purify their society, a mindset that would easily pivot to purifying the government of tyranny in the coming decade. As September 30th 1763 faded into October. The mood in British America was grim. The euphoria of August that came from Bushy Run had evaporated in the mists of Niagara Falls. The Devil's Hole Massacre proved that the enemy was not just a loose collection of tribes, but a growing confederation that now included the powerful Seneca. September 1763 taught the British Empire a hard lesson in logistics and geography. First of all, that you can win the battles like Bushy Run, but you can also lose the war, like in Devil's Hole. The British Army could hold the forts, but they could not hold the roads. They were an occupying force in a hostile continent, bleeding men and money with every passing week. For the colonists, September was the month that the West began to feel like a curse. The land that they had conquered from France was now a slaughterhouse that they were forbidden to settle by the coming proclamation, but required to pay for by the coming taxes. The stage was set for October, when the king would finally put pen to paper and issue the proclamation that would turn the Appalachian Mountains into a prison wall, sparking the first true constitutional argument of the Revolution.